Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy Was Raised by Whitebeard. Please like and subscribe and enjoy the video. Are we sure about this, Yoi? Commander Marco asked once more just to make sure. Yeah, Pops, this whole situation is weirding me out. I mean, why would the leader of the revolutionaries want to meet with us? Commander Thatch said, agreeing with his best friend. Why don't we all just wait and see? I mean, Garp's a nut job, who's to say his son is any better? Commander Haruta said, giving Thatch an annoyed look in response. Whitebeard's laughter boomed, indicating that he was listening to his children, but agreed with Haruta. Just wait and see. There, in the distance. Thatch said, leaning over the railing to see better. Pops, I think that's him. A small boat was sailing slowly towards the grand ship. On that small boat was a figure draped in a green cloak that covered most of his body and shadowed his face. Greetings, new gate, permission to come aboard. Monkey D. Dragon asked, looking past the many crewmates and directly towards the captain. Permission granted, though why would Garp's rebel brat want to meet with me? Whitebeard asked, eyeing the man, his interest growing. Dragon just looked the man in the eyes before he pulled his arm out of his cloak, showing the surrounding pirates a small bundle. This here is my son. He said, making every eye widen and a few mouths comically drop. What are you here for, brat? Whitebeard said once he himself recovered from the initial shock. I want you to raise Luffy, my son. His mother is a dangerous person and my reputation will make his existence a sin against the world. We want him to grow and be free, everyone deserves to be free. Who is his mother exactly? Marco asked, now looking at the sleeping baby in Dragon's arms. No one you need to concern yourself with. He stated as if it was the most unimportant thing in the world at this moment, in which case it probably was. I see, why don't you get your father to raise him? He would probably love the chance to watch his grandson grow. Whitebeard stated, watching the man carefully. Where my father has a good heart and cares deeply for his family, his idols of training are mildly abusive at best. Also, the man can't keep a secret for the life of him. I'm betting Sengoku knows I'm his son, meaning they will know of Luffy soon enough. I did mention to my father of his new grandchild. He paused, looking down at the child in his arms. I want him to grow up free from the chains of this world. My father will try and push his idols upon him, and chaining him to a village will make him feel trapped. I know how you see your family, I ask that you let him into it. Dragon felt his son waking, so instead of looking at the older man, he put his attention towards the boy. Luffy just opened his eyes and smiled before grabbing his father's finger to gum. Yes, I know you're hungry. Dragon chuckled softly, pulling a rather large bottle from his cloak. If you do choose to take him, his appetite rivals my father's and one day probably yours. Dragon said, smiling now. Everyone could tell he loved his son. His entire way of holding himself screamed proud father. What shall we tell him of you? He may wish to know who his father actually is one day, and I won't hide the fact you're not among the crew. Whitebeard asked as Marco went and took the baby from Dragon's arms. Tell him the truth if he asks. Tell him I want him to be free, find what he believes in and chase it. Either way we'll meet again on the sea. You're a happy baby, aren't you, Yoi? Marco said, smiling at the child in his arms. Luffy just smiled wider and babbled happily. A little too happy for just a little guy, don't ya think? Thatch muttered, but couldn't help but feel charmed by the baby's presence. Luffy, with his dark eyes and hair, had captured everyone's heart with just one look. Dragon studied the group with his son before giving the baby a kiss on his nose. Be safe, be free. He whispered. Luffy just laughed. His full name is? Whitebeard asked Dragon, knowing full well he would be dealing with a D. Monkey D. Luffy, he will need a lot of food. I'm hoping you can ask for some from your territories, but my group here. He trailed off, now motioning his hand towards a smaller ship that had come during the time Dragon was there. Has a few starter items to help you along for the time being. Thank you for this, Whitebeard. Dragon said, turning his back towards the older man before hopping back on his ship and sailing off with the others. Monkey D. Luffy, Guerrera, welcome home, my son. He said to the small child who was gripping Marco's finger and falling asleep. Marco smiled at the child, knowing full well life on the Moby Dick was about to change forever. When Marco said life was about to get interesting, he didn't know just how right he was. Luffy was a happy baby who only cried when he had absolutely no other choice, meaning for things such as diaper duty, and, if you caught those things in time, his crying could be cut down drastically. Pops had appointed Marco his caretaker, seeing how he was the first to take the child from Dragon. Marco wanted to protest that he was too busy being the first division commander, but every other commander had either disappeared or pretended they couldn't help. Thatch, being his best friend and fellow commander, knew that if Marco was stuck on Luffy duty, then he might as well be as well. Does he ever stop eating? Thatch whined. The baby was just finishing off his second bottle that morning. Well, he is a D. He's going to eat a lot, regardless, Yoi. Marco muttered, wondering just where that food was going. Still, it's as if he's always hungry. Thatch pouted but smiled at the brat who had just put himself into a milk coma. Looks like we might be set for at least 3 hours. Vista said from the wall he was leaning on. Yeah, only for him to wake up and want more food. Yoi, Marco chuckled, looking at the now sleeping baby fondly. It had been months since Dragon had come and dropped the baby off, and the mood on the crew had changed. Everyone couldn't help but feel charmed by the new brat on board. Luffy smiled often and laughed just as much. He babbled to everyone as if they could understand him. This day was different though. He's not smiling, Thatch had whispered. It was a rare sight to see. Luffy without his smile just didn't happen. Have you tried feeding him? Haruta asked, now looking down at the grumpy child. Yeah, but he refuses to take it. Yui, Marco was worried, but his lazy expression remained the same. What about his diaper? Maybe he's she suggested, but Marco just shook his head. He was fine an hour ago, he even played on the deck for a while, but now I don't know, Thatch said, shrugging his shoulders. Do you guys think he might have lost a toy? I mean, for a baby he's pretty protective of his things. Aizu had said, showing up to see what was going on. I didn't think about that. Yui, passing the now squirming 6-month-old Luffy to Thatch, he made his way over towards Pop's chair, looking around. What's happening, Marco? The old man asked his son. Luffy's grumpy. Aizu said he might have lost a toy, so I'm looking around for what could be lost. He checked the area where Luffy had been sitting up playing with his blocks. He counted each one of them, but realized Luffy's stuffed reindeer was gone. When Marco jumped up from the blocks with a look of panic on his face, the old man couldn't help but laugh. His eldest son, who had fought many battles never showing a hint of fear, was afraid that his brother had lost his special toy. It's gone, no wonder he's grumpy. Yoi. I'll have to talk to Aizu. He nodded towards Pops, who just smiled at his brat, watching his run towards the gathering group. Well, are they all there? Vista asked, trying to calm a now tearful Luffy, who looked one moment away from a tantrum. No, his reindeer is gone. Aizu, could you work something up, anything at all, and I'll owe you. Yoi. Marco was now snatching Luffy from Vista, who appeared to be making things worse. The cross-dresser just laughed before heading to his room to work on what he could for the brat. Luffy, Rain-chan has gone on vacation, Thatch said to the little guy, who now looked him straight in the eyes. Rain-chan won't be back for a while, so he is going to send his nakama to keep you company. Luffy's eyes widened, but the frown remained. He'll be here soon, so be patient, okay? Luffy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't burst, not yet at least. I think we have until dinner time before he loses it, Yui, Marco said with worry. Why don't we try to distract him until then? Vista said, looking down at the little guy. Marco carried him back over to Pop's chair to play with his block again, but Luffy was not interested at all. He grabbed them, looked at them and threw them away with a glare. Okay, lesson learned, when Luffy gets grumpy, keep flying objects away from his angry hands. Thatch had caught a block to the knee and didn't look ready to take another. Let me see him. Pops had said from his chair, making his sons look towards him. You sure, Pops? He's not in the best of moods. Thatch had said in warning. Let me see what I can do. Marco scooped up the baby and put him on the older man's lap. Whitebeard held Luffy up with a large hand so he could sit properly on his lap but still have his back and neck supported. Would you like to hear a story, my son? Luffy just looked at the older man, his face blank of all emotions. Whitebeard took this as his cue to get into a story for him. Luffy had paid as much attention as a baby could, giving Marco and Thatch some time to think. The time limit they had given before Luffy burst was exactly on point. Once dinner was called, Luffy snapped. He cried and cried, no one could stop him, not even his beloved bottle. He missed his first hour of feeding. He's off schedule. That and him being cranky already, we're about to have a little monster on our hands, Thatch said, rubbing his forehead. He was right, Luffy cried right through the first 30 minutes of dinner before his outcome running in with a stuffed colorful bear in his hands. Hey there, Lu. Aizu said to the little guy, who stopped crying for the moment to look at the man. I heard Rain-chan went on vacation. He sent here Kuma-chan to keep you company until he comes back. Luffy looked at the bear in his hands before he gave a hiccup and reaching towards the toy. Is he feeling better? He did look better, his crying had all stopped and he pulled the bear close to him to hug. The only thing out of place still was his lack of a smile. How's Luffy doing? Is he still crying? Aizu turned to see Teach of the 2nd Division walking towards them. His crying has stopped, but he still seems a bit out of place. Aizu was now feeling worried himself. He'll be okay in a bit, he just needs to get to know his new bear, right buddy? Thatch had said, rubbing Luffy's hair. Zahaha, sure thing, I hate seeing the kid so sad. Teach smiled before walking away. Don't us all, Yoi? Marco agreed, looking down at the child who was now smiling. See, much better. Aizu smiled, grateful that his brother was going back to normal. He'll want food now that he's happy again. I'll go get the bottle ready. Thatch said, getting up and heading towards the kitchen. Always smile, Lu, we love it when you smile. Marco whispered into Luffy's hair while the baby cuddled his new bear. The day was an unusually typical pirating day for the Whitebeard pirates. It was just nearing dusk and a party was in full bloom. Why was there a party? Well, they're pirates of course. What pirate doesn't party, but really there was a special reason. Today happened to be Luffy's first birthday, and because of that they just had to throw the little guy a party he would never remember. The music was loud and the laughter if not louder, everyone was drunk in the galley, on the deck, and pretty much all over the Grand Moby Dick. Well, everyone except poor Marco. When they had decided May 5th was going to be Luffy's birthday, they had gathered a bucket full of everyone's names and drew the person who was not allowed to drink but to spend the night watching the one the party was aimed towards. "You must think we're all crazy, don't you, Yoi?" he said to Luffy, who was being bounced on Marco's knee. "We're having a drinking party for a child way too young to even remember this." He smiled when Luffy just mumbled a bit of nonsense. Marco looked at the rest of the crew and sighed. "Looks like no one else will remember this night either, Yoi." By this time Luffy was tired of being bounced and told Marco so by biting his hand. "You're getting some pretty sharp teeth in there, aren't you, buddy?" Marco shook his hand, realizing that actually did hurt. "Teeth? Since when?" A very drunk Thatch came stumbling towards the pair. "About a month ago, Yoi. He's been waking up throughout the nights because it hurt so much," Marco said, but wasn't actually sure if Thatch was listening. "Why don't you try giving him an ice cube? That way he can cool them down, and if it melts, it's just water," he pointed out to his friend. Marco was actually surprised Thatch was even able to think that hard by this point. "That is actually a good idea, but not when he's sleeping. I don't care if it's frozen water. I don't want him choking, Yoi," Marco said sternly to the older man, who was now laughing. "We should probably start him on some bigger solid foods, Yoi. To get his tummy ready for growing, ain't that right, buddy?" Marco cooed to the child. "Yeah, we'll make sure his first meal is pineapple." Thatch burst out laughing to a now unamused Marco, "You know, like you." Marco was ready to punch the guy over the head but kept himself calm due to Luffy being present. "Take your drunken ass to bed, Thatch, and remind me to kill you in the morning, Yoi." Marco's eye twitched as Luffy laughed along with Thatch, probably with no clue what was going on. "Yes, mother hen, or should I say mother pineapple." Marco pulled Luffy into his arms and aimed a kick towards Thatch's head, missing by a hair while the man ran off to cause trouble elsewhere. "Mother chicken, I'll get him back for that. Why don't we get you changed and fed before us both head off to sleep, Yoi? Sound good, brat?" "Of course it does. You get fed, though tomorrow we'll be adding extra things to your menu." He smiled and headed towards the kitchen to warm up the bottles for bedtime and maybe make himself a tea. Yeah, a tea sounded nice. At breakfast the next morning Luffy was happily munching on a piece of apple and a slice of tangerine. He seemed to like the tangerine more than the apple, but food was food in his big brown eyes. Pretty soon he'll have a full mouth full of teeth, so if he starts to bite you make him stop so he doesn't continue that, Jozu said to the pirates that were at the breakfast table. Though his skin could turn to diamond and Marco could just flame up, normal people like Thatch and Haruta might not appreciate being bitten by a toddler. Even though he had said this, he knew half the crew wasn't in their minds to listen to him. Everyone was either hungover or exhausted from partying all night. Oh well, he'd just make Marco remind everyone a little later. Haruta sat down beside the little guy and smiled. "Nah, wanna see what I've been teaching him?" She smiled widely at everyone before taping Luffy on the nose to get his attention. "Luffy, where are your ears?" Very suddenly Luffy stopped eating and lifted his hands to his ears with a smile. "How about your eyes?" Luffy moved his hands down from his ears towards his eyes and forehead area, the smile still in place. "How about your mouth?" Like the times before, he moves his hands towards his mouth and gummed his finger where teeth hadn't come in yet. "How about your nose?" Everyone was watching with fascination as the little guy did the movements, except Luffy didn't know just where to grab, so he reached for his half-chewed-up tangerine instead. "It's still a work in progress, but I do plan to make sure he has more brains in his head than half the crew does put together." She earned a round of laughter and grumbles from those present to hear her. "Urarara, he's growing up so fast," Pop said fondly about his youngest son. "Yes, soon he'll be walking. His legs are getting stronger by the day. He crawls around everywhere already and pulls himself up on the railing often enough. I'd give him another month or two to figure it out and we'll be chazzing him in no time, Yoi," Marco said with a laugh and patted the little guy's head. "He crawls funny though, haven't you noticed that?" Thatch pointed out where most babies crawled on their hands and knees. Luffy just seemed to drag his back leg and crawl with his other. "Yeah, Dr. Myra looked into it already, said everything is fine, he's just being weird. It's something he'll grow out of, Yoi," Marco said, not worried if she said it was fine. "Well, hopefully he won't have to and he'll be walking soon enough," Aizu said with a grin. Marco had bought him a fine bottle of sake for the bear. Luffy couldn't function without it being close by. That toy was also the reason he was able to fall asleep so well. Though since Luffy started teething, the bear's ear had become Luffy's personal chew toy. Some days when Marco needed revenge on one of his annoying Nakama, he would get the person to remove the bear from Luffy's dooley mouth to be cleaned before he woke up. The drool-covered bear was never a pleasant sight, but it satisfied Marco some to use it to his advantage. Forget walking. I can't wait until he starts to talk. Thatch said in excitement, which sparked a conversation on what Luffy's first words might be. Don't grow up too fast, kiddo, but you can't stay too young forever. Oh, the dilemma of being a brother. Thatch dramatically sighed, making everyone laugh. Their brother was growing way too quickly, but at the same time way too slowly. Though that didn't really matter at the moment, everyone was just happy to have Luffy to call their brother. Luffy was sitting on Whitebeard's lap just after lunch, listening to his pops telling a story from his childhood. Luffy was now 14 months old and constantly getting into trouble. Marco, needing a break, plopped the brat down on the old man's lap, without saying a word turned on his heels and walked away. Confused by the development but uncaring, he decided to entertain the boy and see what happened. As he suspected, Luffy couldn't sit still. He was squirming and grabbing at Pop's pants. He looked around often and barely paid any attention to the older man. "What are you thinking about, son?" he asked Luffy, who opened his mouth before closing it, looking frustrated. Pops could only raise an eyebrow at the action. Luffy began to babble sounds of annoyance before Pops knew he wanted down. "And where do you think you're going, brat?" he said as Luffy did his weird crawl away from his chair. Luffy paused for a moment, looked at the older man, then continued on his adventure. Luffy crawled slowly around the deck before grabbing onto a railing and pulling himself up and slowly pulling himself along that for a while. Of course, he could only do that for a little bit and dropped to his crawl once more. Along his little journey, he had decided that he was tired of crawling and chose to roll instead. Whitebeard was talking to one of his children and didn't see the small child slip past his feet under his chair. "Hey, has anyone seen Luffy?" Thatch asked loudly, hoping everyone could hear. "He was on my lap at least an hour ago. He couldn't have gotten far," Pop said, but he too was getting worried. The ship had been quiet. Luffy was never quiet. Thatch knew if Pops didn't know, then Marco was sure to. Racing to the man's cabin, he knocked on the door, only to get a very annoyed, tired-looking Marco. "Is the ship burning down, Yoi?" Marco growled out at Thatch, who knew better than to wake Marco after an all-nighter. "No worse, Luffy's missing." With those words, all sleep and crankiness was forgotten, and Marco was racing towards Pop's chair. "How long has he been missing, Yoi?" Everyone could hear the panic in his voice, but his lazy expression remained the same. "About 2 hours now," Teach said, looking at the first commander. Marco nodded in understanding. Everyone spread out. He couldn't have gotten far. "Namor, check the tides. If perchance he did fall off, you can find him faster than us, Yoi." Namor nodded and dove into the water. Everyone was looking for the brat while Pops watched his children search. His nurses had made it quite clear he was not to move from that chair until his medication had settled into him. "Excuse me, Pops, he might have ended up under your chair. It might not have happened, but it is a possibility," Teach said, getting the older man's approval to look under his chair, and lo and behold was a sleeping baby. "Zahahaha, look at you wanting to be close to your old man," Teach said before reaching in and waking the child. Once he had Luffy in his arms, the baby broke into instant tears. "No need to cry, you're safe, brat," Teach said, trying to calm the kid, but that just made him cry harder. "Boy. He's been found," he yelled out for everyone to hear. Marco was the first one to hear the large man and rushed to Luffy's side instantly. "Luffy?" He saw the baby was crying and did an instant check over him to make sure he wasn't hurt. Seeing nothing wrong with him, Marco removed the child from Teach's arms, only for Luffy to break out in a smile. "What a weird little guy, aren't you?" Teach said, patting Luffy on the head, making him once more become teary-eyed. He seems to not like you that much," Thatch said, arriving beside Marco. "He just doesn't know me yet, Zahaha," Teach said before leaving altogether. "Where in the world were you going, Lou?" Thatch asked the now happy baby that was cuddling close to Marco. "Ma," came from Luffy's mouth, making everyone stop. "What was that, Yoi?" Marco asked the toddler. "Ma. Ma," he just said, looking at Marco. Everyone didn't know if they should break out laughing or celebrate their brat's first word. "Look. Marco shall now be known as Mama Marco." Thatch laughed so hard he doubled over. Ignoring Thatch, Marco smiled fondly at the little guy. "Were you looking for me, Luffy, Yoi?" he said. Luffy just responded with "Ma." "Well, you have had him in your care the most, Marco. I'm not surprised he sees you like that," Pop said with a smile. Luffy looked right at the old man, smiled and said, "Ah." The crew broke out in cheers. Their little guy was learning to talk. "Just watch his next few words be a vocabulary of curses," a crew member joked, making everyone laugh. "Not if I have anything to say about it, Yoi," Marco said with a smile. "Nah, it won't be like that at all. His next word will be Yoi." Thatch was laughing again, but this time Marco didn't care Luffy was calling for him. Ever since the baby had been dropped off, not once had he been out of Marco's sight. Marco pulling an all-nighter to finish reports and file documents and write food lists made him extra tired, and not needing a toddler to deal with. It seemed though that Luffy couldn't be without his ma. You know what this calls for? A party. Everyone cheered in excitement. You going to join us this time, Marco? Vista asked him with a smile. I don't mind watching the brat this time. You missed out on his birthday. Marco only shook his head. Nah, I like spending time with this brat, and honestly watching you all get drunk is funnier than actually joining in, yoi. Luffy was closing his eyes slowly after just letting out a yawn. And it seems the both of us are due for nap anyways. Waving to everyone, Marco headed back towards his room and placed Luffy in his crib. Night Lu, please let me have 3 more hours and all will be good. The baby just mumbled ma and fell asleep. Marco crawled into his own bed ready to gain the hours missed so he could make fun of his family later. Where's he going with that? Thatch asked, watching Luffy walk on his little legs holding a few pieces of breakfast in his hands. No, Luffy, what ya got there, little guy? Harita asked Luffy, bending down to his level. The Arfaz, he said to her proudly with a smile. Breakfast for who, buddy? Thatch asked him. The Arfaz for Mako, he said in his adorable words that made them laugh. Why don't we bring him a plate of food instead, buddy? Thatch chuckled, but Luffy scowled. No. I be Arfaz for Mako. He turned on his heels and went straight to the said man's room. Mako. Mako. Luffy called to the man, hoping he would open the door. He didn't wait long. What is it, brat, yoi? He covered his eyes from the sun, he was so tired. I bro be Arfaz. He reached his hands out, showing the pile of eggs in his little hands. Marco looked down at it in worry but knew he was stuck with it. No one says no to Luffy, it's impossible. Especially when he gives you those big brown eyes that water the moment you consider the word no. Thanks, Luffy, it looks delicious, yoi. Luffy smiled as Marco took the eggs from his hands. I'll put it here for now and eat it in a bit, okay? Luffy smiled as wide as possible to Marco. Ever since Luffy had learned to walk fully and start using more of his words, he began to bring things to people. Most of the time it was a toy, book or just something that belonged to another person. Mostly Marco, Thatch and Pops got the gifts and waited for the person to come and get their belongings. On other occasions people were given food from his little hands. Once one of the crew members tried to deny the food and Luffy broke into devastated tears until the member took and ate it right there and then. Sadly, it was Stefan's dog Kibbles, but it made the kid smile. 6 months had passed and Luffy was now a loud 2-year-old. Marco. Luffy came running towards him at full speed before crashing into his leg, giving a hug. I wasn't gone that long, Luffy, yoi. He chuckled and patted the little kid's head. Did Cha bring me any food, he asked, giving the wide puppy eyes. No, but if you go find Thatch he might have something for you, yoi. He smiled. Nua, I already tried. Luffy exclaimed dramatically. He said to wait for dinner, so I said why. He smiled up at Marco, who just picked the little guy up. Did you eat all of your lunch? Luffy nodded with his smile. But it wasn't enough. Marco ruffled his hair with a smile. Luffy had moved on from baby foods to full-grown meals just as quickly as he had learned to run. You're growing too quickly, little brother, but you're still a shrimp to me, yoi. Luffy hit his fist against Marco's chest. Nua? I'm a big boy now. I too. Marco laughed. Oh? And 2 makes you a big boy? Thatch asked, coming out of nowhere and tickling Luffy, who was trapped in Marco's arms. Stop, Thatchy. Luffy laughed before Marco put him down and he was off. You were able to say not to him, yoi? Marco asked his friend before he went to chase after the kid. I didn't look in his eyes. The kid can't get everything he wants, Marco. He needs to learn that the world will reject him even once in a while. If we spoil him rotten, he'll never grow. Thatch may be the goof on the ship, but he knew what was best right now. Also, have you seen how much he eats? If I said yes, I'd be cooking the rest of the afternoon. Thatch laughed before he raced after the little boy who had stopped to look back at them. Sometimes I forget just where he is. We're lucky there haven't been any major fights either, yoi. Marco trailed off while walking towards Pop's chair. We have been lucky. We can stay close to safe waters for now, but soon enough he'll have to be trained. There may come a time we won't be there for him, he needs to know how to protect himself. Pop said to Marco, who had jumped up to sit on the edge of the older man's chair. Sometimes I wish he'd never grow up, but other times I can't wait to see what he'll become, yoi. Marco smiled at his father. He'll be a force to be reckoned with someday, that's for sure. A man who won't ever take no for an answer, Gurara. Marco couldn't help but laugh along with his father. I'm glad he'll be one of us then, yoi. He smiled, looking out towards the sea, listening to Luffy's laughter ring across the waves. He's going to be big someday, he's going to be strong. Strong enough to change everything, I can just feel it, yoi. I can't wait. Was all the old man said, and they fell into a comfortable silence listening to the crew around them, their family, and their home. It was just before dinner when a loud crash could be heard below deck, a bunch of swearing was heard quickly afterwards, and a naked 4-year-old was running past everyone to hide behind Pops. Luffy? Thatch had yelled, running after the fast kid. Stop hiding behind Pops and take your bath. Thatch was soaking wet and covered in bubbles, his shirt missing, and he was only wearing a pair of shorts. "On one Thatchy," he shouted and stuck his tongue out at the man. Luffy climbed up to Pop's lap, hoping he was safe there. Luffy had been painting 2 hours previously and made quite a mess. Messes needed to be cleaned up and Luffy needed a bath. "Luffy, you're dripping rainbows all over Pop's chair. Don't make me climb up there." Thatch was serious and Luffy knew this, so he snuggled into the older man a little closer. "Luffy, listen to your brother," the old man said, patting his head with his large hand. On one he looked up at Pops, giving the big eyes. Thankfully Whitebeard knew to look away. "If you don't get down here I'll tell Marco what all that paint was for," Thatch said to the boy, who turned his head quickly, his eyes widened. You said you wouldn't. You helped," he shouted to his brother before he wiped the yellow off his nose. "You did most of the work," Thatch argued with the kid. "But you still helped," Luffy shouted back. The argument went for a bit longer before Thatch realized he was arguing with a 4-year-old. "Screw it, you're getting your bath." Thatch had planned to climb up there, but Luffy started to climb higher. "Luffy, why don't we make a deal? You take a bath now and I'll tell you a story right afterwards," Pop said to the kid, who stopped climbing to listen to him. "Story now, bath later?" Luffy asked him, but Whitebeard shook his head. "Bath now, story after. Your brother is right, you're dripping a rainbow everywhere, go and be fast, son," Pop said, picking the boy up and giving him to Thatch. Luffy grumbled but accepted his fate for this week. "Be fast, Thatchy. I want story now," he demanded to his brother, who rolled his eyes and thanked his pops. Once Thatch had Luffy down below deck, everyone thought they'd have quiet for a few moments at least while the brat was being bathed. How wrong they were. "Thatch Yoi," Marco yelled before stomping towards the main deck. "Where is he, Yoi?" He glared at everyone who knew better than to fight an angry Marco. "Better question, where's Luffy?" He looked towards Pops and saw the paint. "He was here, wasn't he, Yoi?" he stated and waited for a crew member to answer him. "He's giving the brat a bath, he's covered in paint. I'm guessing you know why he is like that?" Vista asked from the railing he was leaning against. "Yeah, he painted my room every color he could find. I'm guessing he had Thatch's help since the paint's everywhere and Luffy only has a limited reach, Yoi," he stated unhappily before walking towards the bathroom to confront his prankster brothers. "Never for a moment can we get quiet around here," another crewmate said, but he voiced it with fondness, for no one would have it any other way. Luffy was in tears this time and Marco was trying not to laugh. "It's just a little prick and it will be all over, Yoi," Marco said while trying to hide his smile. "I don't wanna," Luffy shouted at the nurse, trying to calm him down while Marco sat in a chair beside him. "Luffy, you need to get your big boy needles so you don't get sick," the nurse said kindly to him. "I don't wanna," he repeated only louder. "Just where in the world did he learn that phrase?" Thatch murmured, getting tired of Luffy's new favorite words. "I wish I knew, Yoi," Marco said, rubbing his forehead but still smiling. "Luffy, how about this, get your big boy needle and I'll give you some candy," Thatch said to the kid, making him smile, but Marco wanted nothing to do with that. "If you give him sugar he's yours." "I can't deal with a hyper Luffy, Yoi," Marco said after learning his lesson the last time Lou had sugar. "Not going to help me, are you?" Thatch asked him with a crooked grin. "Nope, this one's all yours. I haven't forgiven you yet for my room, Yoi," he said, side glancing at the man. "Marco is a cranky bastard," Luffy cheered, then scowled as the nurse gave him the needle. "And just where did he learn that one, Yoi?" This time Marco was fully facing a now sweating Thatch. Thatch said that. "Then we painted your room," Luffy told the man while Thatch paled. "Luffy, you weren't supposed to say that," he whined to the child. "Oops." He giggled and took the sucker from the nurse before bolting out the door. Marco sighed before slapping his friend on the back of the head. "Whatever. Go get the brat. I wasn't kidding when I said he's yours to deal with, Yoi." Marco stood up and walked out of the room. The kid was bouncing off the walls after that little of sugar, never again. Once the candy was gone it was not coming back. Marco planned to write that down in his books to constantly remind himself. "Wait up, Marco. I was thinking it's about time we start teaching him to swim." Thatch ran to catch up with his friend. Marco raised his eyebrow further. "He's 4 now, that's a perfect age to start. I mean, he's normal like me and not a freak like you, so he should be able to learn," Thatch said offhandedly, making Marco close his eyes in annoyance. "And why am I the freak in all of this? Have you seen how normal you actually aren't, Yoi?" Marco said before walking faster away. "So you don't think it's a good idea?" he asked Marco, who just sighed. "I never said that, Yoi. I'll talk with Nem or you talk with Pops, sound good?" Thatch smiled and ran off to find Luffy and Pops. "Never a dull moment around here, is it, Yoi?" he said, smiling. "He'll be 5 in a few months, kids really do grow up too fast, don't they?" He couldn't help but let his smile grow. Maybe we should start teaching him to fight as well, he thought out loud, another reminder to write in his book. Oh well, it's not like he's that busy running his division or anything. But that he headed towards his cabin to finish his work. He actually sinks. Like an anchor. Thatch had said from where he was standing. Maybe we're not teaching him right, Yoi. Marco said, watching the boy sink yet again. Namor's teaching him, he's a fishman. No one swims better than a fishman. Namor's teaching him right, Luffy just isn't getting it. Aizu said from beside Thatch, watching his little brother being saved by the fishman once again. It's been 2 years, he should at least know how to float. Thatch exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air for extra dramatic effect. Marco sighed before looking down at his little brother. We can deal with that later, we need to get him back on the ship, Yoi. We have visitors coming. With that he stood up and signaled Namor that the lessons were over. Who's coming? Thatch asked seriously, a visitor could mean anything. Akagami Shanks. No clue why, he just wants to meet with Pops, Yoi. He said, but Thatch could feel the tension around him. Marco didn't like Shanks all that much. Once out of the water, Luffy was towel dried and new clothes put on him. Nah, why did we end early? I know I'm bad, but I could have gone a lot longer. He wanted to swim so badly, but his body refused to work for him. We have someone coming to visit, Brad, be on your best behavior. Namor said before taking the towel and drying Luffy's head. Visitor? I've never had one before. Who? Luffy shouted excitedly, grabbing onto Namor's hand, making the fishman smile. Someone strong, so stay by Marco's side and listen to him, alright. He said to the brat, but knew it went right over his head. By the time Luffy was dried off, the crew was starting to gather around Pop's chair. Luffy went running straight to Marco and bombarded him with questions that the man tried to answer as best as he could. So is he as strong as Pops? Luffy said excitedly. Marco chuckled at that. Well, he has the same title as Pops, but I wouldn't ever say he's stronger. Marco smiled to the brat. Luffy had a way to taking away all the tension in the air, making the crew feel more relaxed. Soon enough the Red Force came into view and Luffy was jumping so much Marco just decided to pick him up. Permission to come aboard? Shanks asked from his ship. Whitebeard just nodded and the red-haired man jumped across. Sorry, but this is still a rival ship, I can't let my guard down. He said before releasing a wave of haki. Quite a few of the many division members collapsed around the man as he carried a large bottle of sake towards the captain. Boy Akagami. Watch your haki, you could have hurt someone, Yoi. Marco knew by speaking out he was drawing attention towards him and consequently Luffy. I can never be too careful. No, Marco, wanna join my crew? Shanks asked with a smile, looking towards the blonde man, but his eyes widened at the child in his arms. Never, I'm good here, Yoi. He said, giving the Emperor a glare and holding Luffy tighter. Who's the brat? Shanks asked, his voice growing tighter. Luffy looked at Shanks with wide brown eyes. Somehow Luffy had managed to get past the wave of haki Shanks had released moments before, completely unfazed by it. I'm Luffy. He said, wiggling around in a way to tell Marco he wanted down, but Marco wasn't going to let him go so easily. I didn't think you'd take a child out to see Whitebeard. Shanks said sternly to the older man. He's been with us since birth, brat, we knew the risks. Whitebeard replied, looking down at Shanks. Knew? No fighting. Luffy had bitten Marco and in his surprise he dropped the kid. Don't be mean to Pops. He said, giving Shanks a glare which ended up failing miserably, making Shanks laugh at him. But that's what pirates do, we fight. Shanks said to the kid, who smiled a bit. But don't be mean. Marco doesn't like me seeing people be mean. He'll get cranky and become a bastard. He said to Shanks, who broke out laughing. No wonder you keep the kid on board. He's hilarious. He smiled down at Luffy. What's your dream, kid? He asked Luffy, who just looked at Shanks like he was an idiot. I'm gonna be a pirate. Stronger than Marco, stronger than Pops, and stronger than you. He smiled at Shanks as the man's eyes widened. He subconsciously touched his straw hat, then looked towards Whitebeard, only to see a wide smile on the older man's face. Luffy, why don't we let the captains talk? Thatch said, taking Lou's hand and leasing him away from Shanks. But I wanna stay with my new friend. He whined to his brother. How about this, I go and make you a nice snack and we draw some pictures for the captains for later. Sound good? Thatch said, trying to get the brat to listen. He agreed, taking Thatch's hand and nodding towards Marco, who sighed and watched them disappear below deck. Why are you here, brat? Whitebeard asked Shanks, who sat down. There's a bunch of new rookies heading your way. They bothered us a bit, but we sent them packing. I'm afraid they didn't seem to learn their lesson. Thought I'd warn you before they hit. Rumors have been going around that you've been sticking to safe waters. I wanted to know why, so I came to also get that question answered. Guess I got it. He smiled at the memory of that kid. The child, Whitebeard. You know it's not safe on these seas. He said to the older man, who smiled softly. I agree, brat. I was called upon a meeting with the kid's father 6 years ago and he sprung upon me a brat. I don't regret it, I've watched him grow. He'll make his dream a reality and then he'll make it larger than that." He smiled off in the distance. "I like the kid, we should have a party." He shouted, making his own crew shout in agreement on his own ship. While the captains talked, Luffy had drawn pictures of his pops, Marco, Shanks, and anything else he could think of while stuffing his face with food. "Can we go back now, Thatchy? I wanna see the new guy," he complained once he finished eating everything around him. "My guess it's been a bit, we should be able to go up now." "Alright brat, let's go," Thatch said, getting a cheer from the kid. He took Luffy's hand, leading him back up to the group. Who would have thought that this emperor coming this day would spark a new dream into a young child, and the day was only beginning. "Boy, what are you doing, Anchor?" Shanks said to Luffy, who had been exploring the Red Force with the captain. "I'm going to prove to you I'm as strong as any pirate," Luffy exclaimed, holding a knife in his hands. "Right, you're just a brat still, come on down and I'll get you a glass of juice," Shanks said to Luffy, who just glared at the captain. "I'll prove it." He steadied his hands and pointed the knife towards his face. Shanks laughed and dared him to do something, hoping the kid actually wouldn't. Luffy did. He stabbed himself just below his left eye, blood coming from the wound, and Luffy screaming made everyone stand on edge, and Shanks panicked. "You dumbass," he shouted and ran towards the kid, picking him up and throwing the knife on the ground, a chorus of shit racing through his head. Using his shirt, he tried to stop the bleeding while calling his doctor to fix the mess. Luffy ended up getting 2 stitches, but he didn't lose his eye. "It didn't hurt at all," Luffy said proudly while Marco was giving Shanks a lecture. "Right, then what were those tears for?" Shanks teased, tuning Marco out, who was completely pissed off. "How did he even get the knife in the first place, Yoi?" he said to Shanks, who rolled his eyes and turned back to Marco to argue his case. During that time, Luffy began to look around. "No, Luffy, that was pretty crazy of you. You could have hurt yourself worse. The captain was really worried about you," Yasopp said to Luffy, bringing his attention back. The kid just rolled his eyes. "Then why does he make fun of me?" he argued to the sniper. "Because he cares and he doesn't know how to deal with children. If you were my son, Yasopp, I would have handled it much differently. You know, you're about the same age as my boy. I left him back with my wife in a small village in the East Blue. You and him would get along well, I can see it. He looks just like my wife, even got her nose." Yasopp laughed and continued on about his son. Luffy listened for a while but got bored and decided to look around the galley. "I'm hungry," he muttered to himself. Ben had stepped in, hoping to calm the Phoenix down before he killed the captain, and Yasopp had grabbed one of his Nakama aside to continue his talk about Yasopp. "No, what's this?" Luffy said, opening a small trunk that had been set aside in the galley of the Red Force. Seeing it was a medium-sized fruit and his stomach was growling, he shrugged his shoulders and took a bite. If his stomach wasn't growling so loudly, he would have spat the fruit out, but food was food and never to be wasted. Thatch had taught him to eat everything on his plate, not like he needed to be taught that though. "Boy, Luffy, whatcha you doing over there?" Lucky asked, realizing that the kid had been too quiet. Getting Luffy's attention, he smiled back at the man. "Eating, but this food tastes nasty," he said in return, making the cook realize what Luffy had been eating. "Oi oi," he shouted, making Marco and Shanks look his way, their brows raised. "Captain, I think we have a problem. Luffy just ate our devil fruit," he said, making both men pale then panic. Shanks was the first to react. He jumped up, grabbing Luffy, turning him upside down, and shook him, trying to get him to spit up the fruit. "Throw it up, spit it up, I don't care, just get it all out of your stomach, brat." While he was shaking Luffy, his legs stretched and the kid face planted the floor. Shanks paled further while Marco just rubbed his forehead in annoyance. It was one thing after another. "What devil fruit was it, Yoi?" Marco asked, his head in his hands. Luffy took notice of Marco's tone and got worried. "The Gomu Gomu no Mi. He's now a rubber human," Shanks said with a sigh, making Luffy feel worse. When Shanks put him down, Luffy looked at his 2 friends and saw they were upset. He felt awful. What are the people going to think of him now? Those who have the powers of a devil fruit are often looked down upon, Yoi, Marco said to Shanks, who nodded his head in understanding. "He'll be seen as a free Kora monster in some communities. Life will get harder," Shanks replied without thinking, making Luffy tear up. Before anyone had realized it, Luffy bolted from the room, reminding the 2 men that he was even there in the first place. He raced past the Akagami crew, ran over the board connecting the 2 ships, and ran past his family straight towards his father. When Luffy jumped into the older man's lap and began to cry, Whitebeard raised his brow in confusion and worry. "What has happened, my son?" he said. Luffy just cried harder, but the older man was patient. Marco said that no one would like me because I'm different. And Shanks said that I'll be called a monster or a freak. He cried again. This time Whitebeard wanted some answers. Marco came flying in and landed right in front of his pops. "Is he okay, Yoi?" Marco asked, seeing Luffy was on the man's lap. He's told me quite the story. Care to explain? Pops asked Marco, who looked down in shame. We spoke without thinking. Sometimes it's hard to remember that he's a child yoi. Marco started looking at the kid. He ate a devil fruit, the gomu gomu no mi yoi. Marco said, making Whitebeard understand now. Luffy, your brother didn't mean to hurt you. The older man said to the child, who looked up at him slightly. He was worried about how people outside of the crew might think of you, not how we think of you. He said. This time Luffy sat up to look at his father. So I'm not a monster? He asked softly to the older man. You're no more a monster than Marco or myself, Brad. This time Luffy looked down at Marco, who turned his arm into a flaming blue wing for Luffy to see. Ops, Jozu, and I are just a few of those who have devil fruit powers on this crew. You're just a new addition, yoi. Marco said, smiling up at his brother. Luffy smiled in return. Now Luffy, as an apology, would you like to fly? Marco asked him with a wide smile. Luffy looked up towards Pops for permission before jumping into Marco's open arms. He said, making the men chuckle. Marco swung Luffy from his arms to his back with the kid's arms around his neck, telling him to hold on tight before turning himself into his full phoenix form. Taking off, Luffy felt the wind through his hair, but the warmth of Marco made him feel safe. The Moby Dick and the Red Force turned to small ships from above. Luffy learned at that moment that he loved to fly. Marco smiled as the child was left breathless from everything that was happening. He should have shown Luffy this sooner. They flew for a few hours. Marco enjoyed stretching his wings. It had been so long since he flew so carefree, and Luffy's weight felt like nothing on his strong back. By the time they returned back to the ship, Shanks was packing up and ready to leave. Shanks, sorry for running off like that and eating your devil fruit. Luffy said to the man, who patted his head in understanding. I'm sorry for yelling at you and saying mean things. He said in return. I'm going to miss you. He said to Shanks, making the captain smile. You're going to be a pirate, right? What kind of pirate will you be? Are you going to stay here? Someday be a commander? Or will you someday come join my crew? He asked Luffy, who looked up at Shanks before smiling a mischievous grin. Someday, I'm going to find a crew stronger than yours, stronger than Pop's, and I'll become the Pirate King. He shouted for both crews to hear. Oh? So you want to surpass us, eh? Shanks asked the kid, who nodded his head, a look of pure confidence on his face. Shanks took his straw hat off his head, looked at it for a moment, smiled and placed it on Luffy's head. Then someday when you become a great pirate, return this hat to me in great condition. This hat is very important to me, Luffy. That's our promise. Luffy began to cry at the amount of faith Shanks was giving to him. Luffy would treasure this hat from this day forth. He's going to be big someday. Ben said to Shanks with a smile that Shanks returned. I know, I can't wait. He said before the anchor was lifted and the Red Force sailed off. A pair of hands came up and pulled the boy close. Looks like we got another anchor on the crew, Thatch said, releasing Luffy from his hug. I learned to swim still. He said, pulling his new hat tighter on his head. Didn't anyone tell you? Those who eat the devil fruits are cursed by the sea. They will never ever swim. Thatch said dramatically, making Luffy open his mouth as shock. Well, I'll be strong enough that I won't need to swim. He shouted and ran off, making everyone laugh in response. Our little brat's growing up. Thatch said with a mock tear in his eye. Yeah, pretty soon he'll want to join in on our battles. Namor said, slightly annoyed at all the work he put in to teach the kid to swim was gone. Not yet, yoi. He's got a long way to go before he can make his promise come true. The king of the pirates. Just what kind of brat are we raising? Marco said, shaking his head with a smile. The best kind. Thatch replied, laughing. Thatchy. Thatch. That kitty. What brat? It was early in the morning and the cooks hadn't yet started breakfast, so Thatch saw no plausible reason to be woken up. The sun's out. Luffy said excitedly, jumping around the older man's bed. Then go wake up Marco, I'm still sleeping, he mumbled, trying to close his eyes from the light coming through his now open door. I tried, but he said to go bug you. Luffy said, stomping his foot in irritation. Thatch groaned, making plans for pineapple chicken to be on the menu at dinner time. He realized now that it was quite cold in his room, making him pull his blanket up and tighter. Play Thatchy. Luffy said, trying to pull off his blankets, making the straw hat fall on the ground. Luffy panicked when it fell, making the man open his eyes to realize Luffy was only in his underwear and a tank top shirt in this cold room. Play later, aren't you cold, bud? Thatch said with one eye open. He hated the fact he was starting to wake up. I'm cold. He shouted, suddenly wrapping his arms around himself after putting his straw hat back on his head. Thatch laughed softly and opened the blankets for the kid to climb into. Once in, Luffy snuggled up to Thatch and chattered about everything before falling promptly asleep himself, making the man smile. The kid was never boring, that he could say. Boy, you guys getting up anytime soon, yoi? Marco asked, standing inside of Thatch's room looking at the pair all wrapped up in their blanket. Do we have ta? Thatch whined, hugging Luffy tighter. The kid was a heater. He needed to have the kid sleep over more often. "You'll miss breakfast," Marco said, knowing the effect it would have. "Don't eat all the meat," Luffy shouted, waking up immediately while throwing his hands in the air, punching Thatch in the chin, while making Marco smile in amusement. "We are so having pineapple chicken for dinner tonight," Thatch said in annoyance as his heater jumped into Marco's arms. "Let's get you dressed, brat, it's cold outside," Marco said to the smiling and drooling child. "Chicken," he muttered before realizing Marco had said something cold. "I was cold earlier." "Why's it cold?" he chattered to the man who was looking towards Thatch. "He still has some clothes in here, right? I don't plan to bring him out in what he's wearing now, Yoi." Marco said to Thatch, who was rubbing his chin. Yeah, in the top drawer," he pointed out, getting a nod from Marco as he searched for suitable clothing for the 6-year-old. "It's cold out because we're nearing a winter island, Yoi." Marco could literally see the sparkles in the kid's eyes. "Amazing," he shouted while lifting his arms for Marco to pull the shirt over him. "Does that mean snow?" Thatch asked, putting on his own clothing. Marco just smiled. "Well, let's get breakfast, Yoi," he said, making the now fully clothed and straw-hatted child jump back into his arms. Opening the door, Luffy's eyes widened at the white snow that covered the deck. He wanted to touch it, but Marco held a firm grip on the kid. "After we eat you can play all you want, Yoi," he said, smiling at the kid, knowing that no matter what his stomach would win out every time. "Amen," he said. Thatch laughed at him. When they got to the galley, the commanders listened to Luffy talk about how excited he was for the snow, all while shoveling down enough food to feed a grown man. Once he finished, he grabbed Thatch's hand and dragged him outside to play with him. Thatch loved snow for as long as he could remember. He's loved it for its beauty and playfulness. He started to roll the snow into balls, confusing Luffy. "What ya doing, Thatchy?" Luffy tilted his head in question. "I'm about to teach you the mastery of making snowmen." Thatch grinned while still rolling his ball. "Snowman so cool," Luffy shouted, the stars returning to his eyes. He helped build that snowman with Thatch, making the snowman look like Thatch himself. Luffy, deciding he needed more snowmen so the Thatch snowman wouldn't be lonely, he ran back into the galley, only to return with Jozu and Marco in tow. He made them help build snowmen with him. When Jozu tried to back out, Luffy gave him the puppy eyes. He was finished from there. Before anyone really knew it, the commanders were out making snowmen with Luffy, while Pop sat on his throne watching his children having fun. That was until Marco threw the first snowball. Looking at the commander, he hit with a lazy grin. He ducked as one was sent his way in return. Suddenly a ginormous snowball fight had broken out among the crew. Whitebeard even stepped in to play with everyone under the conditions that when his nurses said enough it would be. Luffy was shorter than everyone else, making it both hard and easy to throw at the same time. Ops, finding Luffy, picked the kid up, putting him on his shoulders and passing snowballs up to him to throw. Everyone was laughing by dinner time when they were all called in for food and cups of hot chocolate. Though most of the crew had a bit of alcohol in their drinks, Luffy loved the taste of his with milk. After dinner, Luffy went out to play once more. His jacket and snow pants covered new pants and a sweater to keep him warmer as the temperature dropped. When Marco and Thatch went to check on him, though knowing he was safe, Pops was out there. They found him asleep in the middle of making his 13th snow angel. They smiled and picked him up, bringing him to his room for the night. Thatch let Marco finish putting the kid to bed. It was only fair he woke up with the kid so Marco could get the good nights. Placing a kiss on Luffy's forehead, he whispered good night and placed the straw hat on the desk before closing the door. He walked over and wished his father good night as he himself headed for bed. Who knew a 6-year-old could make the snow sparkle brighter than ever? It was Luffy's first island adventure and he was practically vibrating with excitement. The moment Marco said he could come with him to order the food supplies, he jumped around the ship telling everyone he could trap. When the ship docked, Marco looked to his division and warned them about causing trouble and the consequences it would have if they did. Luffy wasn't waiting. He grabbed Marco's hand and started to tug, giving the man a look of excitement and impatience. "Come on, Marco. I want to go now," Luffy said with a hint of annoyance. Marco's speech was cutting into his adventure time. Alright, let's go, brat. You need to hold my hand though, okay, Yoi?" he said, earning a smile and a frantic nodding of a little straw-hatted head. Thatch had wandered off on the island saying something about pretty girls and not needing to disappoint, but Luffy didn't pay much attention to him, his own excitement keeping him occupied. Marco was being dragged towards the buzzing town where Luffy had seen a few of the other crew members wander towards an excitement that was contagious. "Our first stop is to place the order, Yoi. Try and be good in the shop, alright?" he asked the kid, who was just smiling looking at everything around him. When they arrived at the shop, the store owner came running out to greet them. Luffy, not one to be shy, said his hellos before he started to run around the shop exploring while he could. The workers chased him around, begging the kid not to touch anything important or break anything. The owner paid all his attention to Marco, who told him what was needed and gave the list out as a reminder. Once Marco had finished paying for the supplies, he thanked the owner, who bowed rather deeply to the commander, who just waved it off, then called Luffy down from the top shelf. Luffy, hearing Marco call for him, jumped into the man's arms and laughed. The workers seemed thankful to watch the boy go, but Luffy waved his goodbyes and thanked them for playing with him. Marco couldn't stop to laugh at the child's innocence. They moved from store to store, buying supplies and giving lists out to different people to get ready before they left in the few days. Luffy was having fun spending his time with Marco, but saw a few children playing in the streets. Luffy had never seen other children before, so he was a bit curious as to what it might be like to talk to them. Pulling on Marco's sleeve to get his attention, he pointed out the kids and asked if he could go play with them. Marco, taking the opportunity to let Luffy have time with other children his age, agreed to let him play as long as he didn't go anywhere. Marco, heading into his next shop, watched as Luffy wandered off to introduce himself, couldn't help but smile. His little brother was starting to grow up. If Luffy was really planning on gathering a crew someday, he knew that he would have to let him go and meet new people. To learn to trust others like he trusted them. Shaking his head, he called over the shopkeeper. Luffy was actually feeling a bit nervous about talking to them. He had never met anyone his age and didn't know just what to say to them. He took a deep breath and smiled, saying hello. The kids looked up, startled that someone they didn't know was talking to them. "I'm Luffy. Can I play with you guys?" They all looked at each other before smiling. "Sure, kid." One said, holding a ball under his arm. "We're about to play soccer, know how to play?" Another boy asked with a grin. Luffy shook his head and tried to listen to the instructions, but only coming to grips of it being a mystery game. The boys looked at each other confused but let it go. Once gathered into teams, the boys kicked past each other trying to score goals. Luffy catching the ball, and because he watched what the other kids did, he figured it would be cool to show off and score a goal of his own. He stretched his leg back past everyone, bringing it back, hitting the ball, sending it flying into the goalie kid, making him fly back and hit a wall with an oof. Everyone froze before suddenly a few kids ran towards the one that got hurt. Luffy moved towards the kid to apologize but was pushed down. "What a freak." One kid shouted towards him. "He hurt Joe. Monsters should be kept away from others." Another kid said, glaring at Luffy. "Did you see what he did with his leg?" a voice said in fear. "He's more than a monster, he's a demon," a voice said with more fear lining it. Luffy looked around in panic, his body shaking. I didn't mean to, it was an accident," he said to them, but the oldest kid, who was closest to him, just glared at him. "Get out of here, you freak. There's no place for a creature like you," he shouted in fear and anger. Luffy just got up and ran. He ran to the shop Marco was in and latched himself to the man's leg. Looking down at the sudden pressure, Marco smiled before putting his hand on Luffy's head, only to feel him shaking. The smile dropped instantly. "Ma. Can we go home now?" he whispered, calling Marco by his childish nickname, making Marco worry more. He bent down and looked Luffy in the eyes, seeing the tears ready to fall. He said he would be back later. To the owner, picked the boy up and headed back to the Moby Dick. The kids were all gone from the area. Luffy was silent the whole way home. Marco cuddled him close until the shaking stopped, but the sadness didn't leave. "Do you want to talk about it, Yoi?" he asked Luffy once he was back on the ship. Luffy just shook his head no, looking towards the ground. Marco didn't press on. Luffy would talk when he was ready. Once dinner rolled around, the crewmates had made their way back to the ship, each laughing, telling stories of their time there. Luffy was silent and picked at his food, not really interested in it at all. "Come on, Brad, eat your food. It'll get cold and we don't waste on this ship," Thatch said to Luffy, expecting him to react in the usual goofy way, but was severely disappointed when Luffy just lowered his head, his hat covering his eyes. "I'm not hungry," he said quietly, but the amount of forks that dropped and mouths that opened made up for the noise. Even Whitebeard went still and began to analyze his youngest son. "What's wrong with him? Is he sick? Did he eat something bad on the island?" Thatch was all in the kid's face, checking him, looking him over, feeling his head only to be brushed off. "Luffy? What's wrong, Yoi?" Marco said, no longer able to keep quiet. The tears Luffy had been holding back for a while started to fill his eyes again. He gripped the table and tried to look away. Everyone was watching him, not really sure what to expect. When Luffy did look up again, he had a smile on his face and laughed. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just not that hungry today," he stated in a forced voice that made the crew present frown deeply. It was Pops who got up and knelt down in front of the kid. "What has happened, my son?" he said softly. Luffy, trying to keep his smile on, just shook his head, but a tear slipped past his defense. Whitebeard picked the kid up and excused himself from the galley, knowing Luffy needed to be alone. Bringing Luffy to his room, he placed him on the bed and sat down, waiting for him to talk. He didn't wait long. I saw kids playing, I wanted to play too." He sniffed, more tears coming. Whitebeard just nodded his head, remaining silent, listening. "They wanted to play a game with a b-ball and I saw how they kicked it, so I thought I'd try too." he said through his tears. Taking another sniff, he continued. I thought if I showed them my new powers they would think it was cool. But I hurt one of them. He cried. Whitebeard nodded in sadness. He knew how hard it was to control a devil fruit power in the beginning. Ah, am I a monster? He whispered, his eyes wide open in fear. Whitebeard wasn't going to have any of that. You're not, you're the furthest thing from a monster. He said simply to the kid who looked up towards his father. Do you think you're a monster? He let the boy think for a moment before he shook his head as no. Whitebeard smiled at him. Then you are not. He said again. The kid looked at him still. They said there was no place for me to belong. I don't want to be alone. He said. Whitebeard was getting annoyed at those kids. How dare they treat his son like this? You belong here. You are my son and I will always love you. He said, making Luffy smile. For the first time that night, getting into the bed, he let Luffy lay his head against his chest. Do you know the story of the Pirate King? He asked the cuddling boy. Shanks said something about him but not much. He mumbled. Well, let me tell you the story of the man who became the king of the pirates. He began his tale and by the end of it Luffy fell asleep. A knock was made on his door calling for them to come in softly. Marco and Thatch entered looking worried. Is he okay, Yoi? Marco asked, first looking softly towards the sleeping child on his father's chest. He was rejected by the other children. Was all the older man said, making Thatch curse, and Marco frowned. But Luffy is kind, sure he's excitable but not mean by far, Yoi. Marco defended, making the older man smile towards his sons. He used his fruit power, saying he hurt one by accident. Thatch looked sad. That's the cure of the devil fruits. Can't swim and people fear you, thank God I haven't found one. He said, shaking his head. He'll need us to bring his confidence back up. Thatch said softly. Now. He'll be fine. Those kids weren't worthy of his friendship anyways. Someday he'll find the right people. People that will accept and love him for who he is, devil fruit or not. And when he does we'll welcome them, Yoi. Marco said, smiling. He's going to be the Pirate King after all, right Pops? Thatch said with a grin that made the older man smile. Do you want me to take him to his room, Yoi? Marco asked, moving forward, but the man just smiled and said no to let the boy rest. Marco nodded and bid his father good night before he headed towards his own room. Splitting off from Thatch, he though back to the smile Luffy gave at dinner time. It was forced and sad, it was fake, and he hoped never to ever see that smile again. He would give anything to ensure that. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.